We just covered a step-by-step tutorial on how to pair your PS3 controller with an older iPad running older systems. How does it actually feel to play with physical stick and buttons instead of tapping on a piece of glass? Would it make it worse or better? In this episode, I'm going to try 10 games from different categories and see if a controller is going to make a difference in the world of early mobile games. Well, our very first game is Robbery Bob. The control scheme here is fairly simple, since the game focuses more on your observation skills than complex inputs. There aren't many buttons to manage. This makes it a perfect candidate for mapping to a controller. Using the physical thumbstick feels much better than the virtual one on the screen, because you get far more precision during movement. Another advantage is that the game only requires one single action button. So whenever you try to run around or hide in a box, just press it. Using the controller allows you to focus more on your strategy and less about fumbling with the screen. While the iPad screen is large enough that your fingers won't block the view, this controller setup could be a lifesaver on smaller devices like the iPhone or an iPod Touch, where the screen is very limited in size. Classic air combat games like Galaxy on Fire usually require 3D movements. You're constantly managing your pitch, roll and yaw, and basically we have 3 options here in front of us: the gyro, the on-screen joysticks, or a real controller. Using an analog stick is the traditional and most intuitive way to play for the most experienced players. And since we're on the iPad though, the default gyro and tilt control is also a good choice, because it kinda turns your device into one big joystick and makes you feel like you're actually piloting the ship. It's pretty solid and immersive, but holding an iPad full for longer sessions can be quite exhausting for your arms. So by mapping everything to a controller, the whole experience feels much more effortless, and it's like you can finally sit back on a couch and enjoy the game like on a real console. Modern Combat 4 was a massive hit by Gameloft. It's designed to go head-to-head with Call of Duty, trying to aim for that high-quality console experience. So the controls are quite dense. You have buttons for jumping, crouching, reloading, ADS, and switching weapons, and all the swords kinda scattered across the screen. On a 10-inch iPad, trying to reach all those different corners during combat can feel incredibly exhausting. So now we're moving everything to the controller. All these essential buttons are right under your fingertips. It actually helps a lot with smoothing out the gameplay. But keeping in mind that this game doesn't have native controller support, the stick is essentially simulating a touch and drag motion on screen. So you might still notice a bit of latency when looking around and aiming compared to other modern games with full controller support. But for me, this is a very solid upgrade than touch. Shift 2 is famous for its helmet cam, a view that mimics the driver's head movement. This is particularly immersive when you're in the cockpit mode. The default tilt to steer is the classic way to play a racing game on a smartphone, and it works very well if you just want to use your iPad like a steering wheel. That being said, the weight of these older iPads still matter a lot here, just like with other games that heavily rely on gravity control. But fortunately, the game also provides an alternative way of steering by tapping either side of the screen, so we can just map these touch areas to our controller and steer our car with the touch buttons. Since the car accelerates by itself in this game, you don't have to worry about pressing the gas pedal, so you can just sit back and enjoy the racing with minimal effort. This Rayman game runs on the UBR framework, the same engine used for Rayman Origins on consoles, and it looks gorgeous. But on the mobile as a platformer, the controls have been streamlined to just 2 buttons. Despite its simplicity, you still need to time your jumps and attacks perfectly to collect all the stuff in each level. On a touchscreen, you're just tapping a cold piece of glass with 0 feedback. And after we switch it to the PS3 controller, there's this tactile, clicky response that makes platforming feel much more alive. Mapping different actions to different fingers on both hands allows for a much better coordination. It transforms a simple mobile game into something that feels like a dedicated handheld title. Grand Theft Auto is the benchmark PC and console game, and the mobile version is almost a direct port of its original. And like many other major 3D titles, it kinda scatters a bunch of virtual buttons on the screen, which can be distracting and hard to navigate from time to time. So using a controller kind of brings the game back to its roots. But there's also a technical detail to watch out for when using Blue Troll here. These early mobile versions of GTA don't have native controller support, and it uses two completely different button layouts, one for walking around and the other for driving. So make sure you've mapped both configurations in your settings, or your controller will stop working the moment you hop into the car or step onto the sidewalk. Goat Simulator is pure chaos, and quite demanding for older CPUs. Especially on the iPad 4, the physics engine is constantly calculating collisions, and it will make the machine runs a bit warm in the back. So having a separate controller effectively turns the iPad into a dedicated monitor, so you wouldn't have to feel the warmth at all. The mapping for this game is very easy since it doesn't require that many action buttons to work. Having some tactilities for all the chaotic stunts makes the game feel much more alive and comfy to play, even for longer sessions. As a fighting game, Shadow Fight 2 is actually extremely optimized for mobile. It uses a combination of virtual joystick and only two action buttons to work out different combo moves. But constantly holding and dragging a stick on a screen can make it very easy to miss over time. So moving these controls to the PS3 hardware gives you a significant advantage. Fighting games always feel more natural with physical D-pad or analog stick. By bringing these simplified touch controls back to a traditional controller, the execution of combos becomes much more consistent. Sports titles are a natural fit for controllers, whether it's football or basketball. These games usually require high precision for player movement and passings. Either with a keyboard or a controller, the mapping is usually a direct one-to-one translation. Playing FIFA 13 this way feels almost identical to playing the console version. One thing to note is that the touch version includes a unique swipe gesture for some special moves. Those are particularly difficult to replicate with button mappings. But for standard games, the controller handles everything you need perfectly.
You've got to say that's good defending.
Similar to Rayman Run, Bike Baron is also very easy to set up. There are only four main inputs: accelerate, brake, and leaning forward or backward. Once these are mapped, you can set the iPad down and play from a distance. The touch controls on this game were already quite good, so switching to the controller is more about elevating the overall experience. After going through all 10 games, the answer I think is pretty clear. For games that rely on precision, movement, or multiple inputs like shooters or racing, the PS3 controller is a huge upgrade. Everything just feels more grounded and consistent, and honestly, closer to a real console experience. But for simpler mobile games, especially those designed around touch from the ground up, the difference is smaller. Sometimes, it's just about comfort rather than performance. But more importantly, having the controller isn't just about unlocking a new way to experience old games, but also moving your fingers away from the screen and back into a familiar setup, which actually helps you focus more on the gameplay instead of trying to learn the button placement every time you pick up a new game. And for older devices as heavy as an iPad, being able to set it down and play from a distance might actually be the biggest upgrade of all. This wraps up this episode. If you're into this kind of a setup and retro gaming, consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.